Okay, so today we're going deep on this pretty fascinating report, the Geopolitical Outlook,
Mm.
as of April 2025. And I think it's going to give us all a really, really interesting look at the some of the big changes that are happening across the world right now. Really kind of help everyone listening understand what's going on.
Yeah, this is it's a really comprehensive report. It covers, kind of everything, trade policies, military strategies, different regions, all that. We've kind of pulled out some of the big highlights. So, hopefully we can give everybody a good understanding of what the major forces at play are right now, without getting too lost in the weeds.
Yeah, sounds good. So let's jump right into it.
Hmm.
This report really focuses on America's new global strategy. And with Trump back in office, it looks like there's been a pretty big change. Less cooperation, more coercion, as the
Mhm.
report puts it. Can you give me a concrete example of what that looks like?
Well, one of the things that jumps out right away is this universal 10% tariff.
Wow.
Yeah, and they're really framing that as a major tool for, projecting influence on all sorts of issues, geopolitical issues. And the report even mentions the possibility of reciprocal trade penalties. So basically, they're willing to escalate if other countries start pushing back.
So using trade as leverage.
Interesting.
Exactly. So what about America's allies? It seems like this new approach is putting a lot of pressure on alliances, especially NATO. The report talks about this idea of conditional engagement.
Yeah.
Based on how much countries contribute to their own defense, are we basically asking our allies to pay up or get out?
It kind of seems that way. Yeah, the analysis here really points to both financial and diplomatic pressure being put on NATO partners. And this idea of conditional engagement is basically saying, hey, the U.S. commitment to this alliance, it's not automatic. It depends on whether allies are spending enough on their own defense. And that obviously is causing, quite a bit of anxiety, I think, in places like Europe and Japan,
Hmm.
who are now wondering, how reliable are these long-term U.S. security guarantees really?
Right. That's a huge shift. The report also talks about the U.S. pivoting inward while projecting strength, which kind of sounds like a contradiction.
Yeah.
How can a country pull back and project power at the same time?
Well, I think the idea is that they're reprioritizing, so focusing more on domestic issues, but at the same time they're maintaining, a very strong and visible military. So think of it as, showcasing their military might to deter potential adversaries, but not necessarily being as willing to intervene in regional conflicts or get involved in these extended overseas commitments, which, as the report points out, creates power vacuums. In places like the Sahel, South China Sea,
Hmm.
places where other countries are going to be eager to step in.
Which brings us to Asia. It's interesting how the report describes Asia's growing influence. They say it's happening not through war games, but through systems. What kind of systems are we talking about here?
Well, it really seems to be about building these long-term interconnected frameworks, rather than relying on like overt military displays. So, for example, China, they're doing a lot of things. They're diversifying away from the dollar to strengthen their economic security. They're investing heavily in AI, in quantum computing, trying to achieve energy independence. They are conducting military exercises, but they're described as calibrated. So, they're present enough to send a message, but not so aggressive that they're, provoking a major conflict. So basically what they're doing is they're trying to establish dominance
Yeah.
through economic power and infrastructure.
And it sounds like India is playing a pretty interesting role in all of this, too. The report calls them the world's favorite fence sitter and a potential power broker. That's a pretty tricky balancing act.
Yeah, well, India, they're really expanding their tech and manufacturing sectors. They're becoming a real alternative hub for global supply chains. And at the same time, they've maintained this neutral stance in a lot of global conflicts, which has allowed them to build these strong economic ties with both the West and the East. So they're kind of playing both sides, which makes them, a valuable partner to a lot of different countries. And it also gives them this unique opportunity to act as a mediator in these complex geopolitical situations.
Right. And the report also mentions the ASEAN economies and their strategic ambiguity. It seems like they're deliberately keeping their options open.
Exactly, and they're benefiting from that. RCEP, that's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, is really accelerating economic integration across Southeast Asia, but they're not aligning themselves completely with any single major power, which allows them to attract trade and investment from various sources, including Western capital looking for alternatives to China. It's a smart strategy to maximize opportunities and minimize risk.
It really is. And it's interesting how the report keeps using this phrase, disciplined, not dramatic, to describe Asia's approach. It's almost the opposite of what we're seeing in other parts of the world.
Yeah, that's a key contrast. Asia seems to be focused on the steady, consistent progress, strategic positioning. They're avoiding unnecessary confrontations, and they're really concentrating on building long-term strength and influence.
So let's talk about Europe. The report paints a somewhat more challenging picture there. It talks about this gap between the EU's strategic ambition and its harsh logistical limits. What exactly are those limitations?
Well, one of the biggest things is funding. There's been a lot of talk about Europe rearming, but the report suggests that this big 800 billion euro rearmament plan is mostly for show. The actual committed funding is much lower, something like 150 billion in long-term loans, which really highlights the financial constraints that they're facing. And that's obviously going to limit their ability to achieve true military autonomy.
Right. And it sounds like there are also some cracks in EU unity
Yeah.
when it comes to defense spending.
Yeah, the report specifically mentions Hungary, Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands as examples of countries that are either resisting or, finding ways to kind of hedge their commitments to collective defense financing, and that obviously weakens the EU's ability to act decisively on security matters.
It does. And on top of that, the report mentions shrinking support for Ukraine.
Yeah.
It seems like the global appetite for this conflict is waning.
Yeah, that's a big concern. The report talks about a decline in both the volume of aid being provided and the political will to stay engaged, both from the US and the EU. And that's really putting Ukraine in a tough spot as this conflict drags on.
So with the U.S. kind of stepping back and Europe facing its own problems, this idea of Europe achieving strategic autonomy seems pretty far-fetched right now.
Yeah, the report really casts doubt on that, with these logistical constraints and these growing divisions within the EU. It's hard to see how Europe could effectively fill the void if the US pulls back even further. The report even mentions Kaja Kallas, the Estonian prime minister, as an example of a leader talking tough, but not really backing it up with spending. In fact, some European countries are spending about the same on defense as Greece, which kind of says it all.
Right. All right, well, let's dive into some of the global hotspots now. The Russia-Ukraine situation is described as a war of attrition that's becoming a negotiation. What's driving this shift?
Well, on the ground, it's a stalemate. Russia still controls a lot of territory in the east, and they're continuing their drone warfare campaign. But Ukraine is struggling to maintain that Western support that we talked about. And with the U.S. cutting back on aid and the EU becoming less unified, the report suggests that there are some real politic discussions happening behind the scenes, which might mean that some kind of border adjustments could be on the table, especially if Trump gets involved in negotiations.
Okay. The Middle East is described as smoldering, not exploding yet. What are the key things to watch there?
So Gaza remains really unstable, even after the ceasefire. Reconstruction is going to be a huge challenge, and internal conflicts continue. Tensions between Iran and Israel are still high. They're mostly playing out through cyber attacks and proxy wars for now. But it's a volatile situation. We also have to keep an eye on the Houthis. They've been disrupting shipping in the Red Sea, which really highlights Europe's weakness in the face of these kinds of asymmetric threats. And then you have the Gulf states. They're hedging their bets. They're talking to China, to Russia, exploring alternatives to the dollar. It's clear that they're not putting all their eggs in the U.S. basket anymore.
Got it. Now, the report describes a quiet realignment happening in Africa under the radar, with a focus on BRICS engagement and digital economies.
Yeah, it's interesting. There are a number of major African economies. Egypt, Ethiopia, Algeria, Nigeria, they're all being courted by the BRICS nations, which suggests a potential shift in alliances. And we're also seeing China ramping up infrastructure investment again. But perhaps the most fascinating trend is this rise of decentralized digital economy models. The report suggests that these models could offer an alternative path to development, one that bypasses traditional state-controlled systems. So Africa's future might be much more digitally driven than people realize.
Right. And Latin America is being called the sleeping hemisphere. Not in crisis, but definitely developing its own unique dynamics. What are some of the things happening there?
Well, Mexico's in a tough position. They've got to balance the threat of these renewed tariffs from Trump with the growing influence of Chinese capital. It's a tough choice. Brazil is leading the way within Mercosur. They're cautiously exploring closer ties with the BRICS Plus group. And then you have Argentina. Their experiment with libertarian economics is already running into problems. So the overall picture is that Latin America is becoming more independent, more assertive. They're pursuing their own interests. And they're not afraid to put up barriers to protect those interests.
Interesting. Okay, so now let's talk about the Global South and the BRICS plus alliance more broadly. The report says we're seeing a parallel system in formation and an acceleration of de-dollarization experiments. How is this playing out?
Well, there are some pretty concrete examples in the report. So BRICS plus nations are testing these new clearing systems for trade. They want to use their own currencies instead of the dollar. There's also growing interest in gold-backed settlement mechanisms, and they're even developing these AI-powered platforms to facilitate trade outside of the traditional Western-dominated financial networks. So they're basically creating an alternative system. It's not necessarily about attacking the West, but it is about diversifying their options and becoming less reliant on the US and Europe.
So stepping back a bit, the report also talks about some big underlying global realities. And one of the main points is that the current economic model is unsustainable.
Right. And the reason they say that is because of all this, cheap money and government spending that we've seen for decades. The quantitative easing after the 2008 crisis, the huge stimulus packages during COVID, all of that has created a really unstable situation. And now central banks are stuck. If they raise interest rates to fight inflation, they risk causing a recession. But if they don't, inflation could spiral out of control. It's a real dilemma.
And another key point is that the Global South, despite a lot of promises, hasn't really seen the progress that many were hoping for.
Yeah, the report is very clear on this. Debt burdens in many developing countries have actually increased. They feel that the big multilateral institutions still favor the West. Commodity prices haven't delivered the kind of economic boost that some expected. And BRICS, plus, while it's a powerful political bloc, hasn't really translated into real economic gains for most people. So there's this disconnect between what leaders are saying and what people are actually experiencing on the ground.
And then finally, the report points to this trend of worsening conditions for people around the world, even as the elites seem increasingly out of touch.
Yeah, that's a disturbing trend. The middle class is shrinking in a lot of Western countries. Young people everywhere are facing huge challenges: student debt, lack of opportunity, a broken social contract. And people in the Global South are struggling with inflation, insecurity, a lack of trust in their governments, and all the while the global elites seem to be, living in their own bubble.
So to sum up this deep dive, really paints a picture of a world in transition. We're seeing a more unilateral America, a rising Asia, a struggling Europe, and a Global South that's increasingly charting its own course.
Exactly. And all of these trends are interconnected. They're being driven by powerful economic and social forces. The old order is changing, and the new one is still taking shape.
So this leaves us with a big question for you listening. In this new world, where so many of our assumptions about power and influence are being challenged, what are the things that we need to rethink? How do we make sense of this complex, changing landscape? And where do we fit in? It's a lot to consider. But I hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought.
Me too. It's going to be fascinating to see how all of this plays out.
Absolutely. All right, well, thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
And to everyone listening, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.